Hello everyone. In June 1941, Hitler's forces were advancing to invade the Soviet Union, driven by a new military doctrine, one that all previous armies had failed to stop. At that time, the defensive lines consisted of artillery positions surrounded by concrete fortifications, heavy guns mounted atop towers, and anti-tank obstacle lines. France built the Maginot Line, Finland constructed the Mannerheim Line, Germany erected the Siegfried Line, and the Soviets also built a defensive line along their western border, which the Western press later dubbed the Stalin Line. In reality, the Stalin Line was not a continuous barrier. It was a series of fortified points. The vast length of the Soviet front did not allow it to be completely covered by machine gun positions, nor were there enough artillery pieces available. Instead, the Soviets were repurposing old tank guns to serve as artillery emplacements. At the time of the German invasion, the Stalin Line was 13 years old and lacked modern anti-tank defenses. Moreover, when the Soviet Union invaded eastern Poland in 1939, the borders changed and the Stalin Line was left unmanned, forcing the Red Army to build new defenses along the new western border. When the Germans attacked the Soviet Union, the situation shifted once again, and the Soviets were forced to retreat in a haphazard and disorganized manner to the Stalin Line. The Soviet commanders had pinned great hope on this line, protecting them from the German onslaught. The first confrontation at the Stalin Line with the Germans came against Panzer Group I, commanded by the seasoned General Ewald von Kleist. At the time of the invasion, he was 60 years old and one of the oldest and most experienced generals in the German army. In 1940, von Kleist had led the same panzer group in France, penetrating French positions at Sedan and encircling the Allies at Dunkirk. In other words, von Kleist's forces had ample experience in breaching fortified lines, whereas the Stalin Line was unprepared to deal with this type of warfare or these kinds of fighters. Typically, the first German assault units were composed of infantry squads and special forces, supported by engineering units and light field artillery. During an attack, the German infantry would encircle the Soviet fortified points in order to isolate them, and then they would strike the concrete strongholds from behind using explosives or flamethrowers to seal off their openings and eliminate their defenders. Von Kleist's tanks reached the Stalin Line at several points simultaneously. The next step was an infantry assault on the Stalin Line. The Germans slowly penetrated the Soviet defenses, and on July 8th, they broke through along the rapid Zhytomyr Road and achieved another breakthrough in the south at Istrabal, thereby opening the road to the Ukrainian capital Kiev. However, as the German forces advanced through Soviet territory, they encountered more heavily fortified and better hidden positions, and the solution, of course, was to pound them with heavy artillery. Next came the assault on the Ukrainian city of Berdichev, and nothing could stop the formidable German army. Everyone who survived from the Red Army withdrew, and all that the Stalin Line had achieved was to delay von Kleist's forces by only 4 days. Back in Berlin, the chief of staff of the German army believed that Kiev had to be taken by surprise, storming it with the element of surprise provided by the Third Army. However, Hitler had other priorities. He ordered von Kleist to move south to help encircle the Soviet forces around Uman. As a result, von Kleist no longer had sufficient time to capture Kiev. They had at most 5 or 6 days. Fearing the fall of such an important city, the Soviets moved all their reserves toward Kiev. Paratroopers, national security personnel, naval infantry, and any available armored units were sent to defend Kiev. The Soviets knew that the Germans would attack from the direction of the Zhytomyr Road, and they had fortified the bank of the Irpin River. Any point along which the Germans attempted to cross would inevitably result in a clash. The Germans reached the fortified area around Kiev, which was the last part of the eastern defensive line, and the city was fully prepared to engage the German forces. As usual, the German armored units were moving so rapidly that they were far ahead of their infantry, and the infantry was in high demand to breach the city's defenses. The time allotted by Hitler had run out, forcing a southward movement to encircle the Soviet forces in Uman, while at the same time, the German infantry was breaking through the Stalin Line in the southwest. This infantry assault was supported by the new self-propelled assault guns from the Southern Army Group, which had engaged the Stalin Line's fortifications around the city of Vinnytsia. These assault guns were one of General Manstein's innovations, not the design of the guns themselves but rather the method of their use. In 1935, Manstein presented his concept to the German General Staff, which involved using self-propelled assault guns alongside infantry, not as tanks or as units trying to break through enemy lines, but as artillery that accompanied the infantry to destroy fortified enemy positions. Manstein arranged for these guns to be grouped together like tanks in battalions so that they could concentrate their fire on enemy defenses. In 1940, the first self-propelled assault gun entered service in the German army, named the Stug 3rd. It was mounted on a tank chassis and equipped with a 75mm short-barreled gun. It was armored in the conventional sense, with armor actually stronger than that of tanks, and its heavy weight was not an issue, as it was never required to be highly maneuverable. The traditional Soviet artillery had no prior experience dealing with these self-propelled guns that advanced so close to enemy positions and directly bombarded them from observation posts. In 1941, the number of these assault guns on the Eastern Front was small, but later the Stug 3 became the most produced armored vehicle in Germany during World War II. The Red Army's defenses around the key position were subjected to varied German artillery bombardments, including contributions from 3 batteries, after which infantry teams and engineering units advanced from their positions. By 9:30 p.m., the German army had managed to seize all the required objectives. For the second time, the Stalin Line failed to repel the German attack, and this time, the Soviet army was exposed and vulnerable to encirclement if it did not withdraw quickly. The breach of the Stalin Line at Flychev proved to be a strategic catastrophe for the Russians. Marshal Semyon Budyonny, who commanded the southwestern region of Ukraine, thus responsible for 2 fronts and in charge of 2 army groups, sent a report to the Soviet High Command stating, first, that restoring the situation to what it was before the German invasion using the current forces was an impossible task. In short, we have been defeated, and second, that the continued resistance of the 6th and 12th Soviet armies in their current positions would lead to their encirclement and annihilation. In other words, we must withdraw immediately. Budyonny, who had been awarded the title of Marshal of the Soviet Union and was very close to Stalin, having commanded a cavalry corps in the Red Army during the Russian Civil War, was still a cavalryman at heart, convinced that tanks were a mere novelty and could never replace horses in war. In short, he was a man of old ways, completely oblivious to the realities of modern mechanized warfare. He requested that the 2 armies withdraw toward the Dnieper River, and Stalin granted permission. At first, the withdrawal was orderly and smooth. However, the head of the German General Staff informed Hitler that the Soviets were slipping away from under their noses. At that time, the Soviets were employing fierce counterattacks and possessed considerable fighting skill, which allowed them to actually evade the Germans. This was the very reason that compelled Hitler to order a unit to move south to encircle the retreating Soviet armies. In August, the Germans tightened their encirclement, and the retreating forces fought desperately for 2 weeks, though ultimately there was no escape. The final outcome of the Uman encirclement was the capture of 108,000 Soviet soldiers, most of whom perished from hunger and disease in German prisoner camps. After the victory at Uman, Panzer Group 1 under von Kleist's command continued its eastward march. Despite all these great victories, von Kleist believed that they were still very far from the operation's main objective, Moscow. Finally, after a 300-mile march, the spearhead of the German 6th Army arrived, fully armed to the teeth with flamethrowers, heavy artillery, and self-propelled Stug 3 assault guns. On June 30th, the 6th Army launched an organized assault on the city's southern defenses, choosing to enter the city from the south to avoid the battles along the Arbil River. The Red Army gradually retreated under the weight of the German attack. Many units emerged from their hideouts but continued fighting. The Germans pushed their way into Kiev, and on August 4th, they escalated the assault, seizing a series of hideouts near Vita Postova, and the following day they advanced to the second defensive line around Kiev. However, this advance came at a very high cost for the Germans. They were losing around 1,600 soldiers daily, while the Red Army was also suffering heavy losses. The Soviets were training soldiers for only 1 week before sending them to the city's defensive line to plug gaps against the German assault. The army couldn't even manage to issue proper paperwork for these soldiers, to the extent that those who died were identifiable only by their party cards or ration books. On August 6th, the Germans commenced their attack on the second defensive line, a day so foggy that one could barely see one's hand in front of them. After fierce fighting, the German forces managed to breach the Soviet defenses and enter the suburbs of the Ukrainian capital. They were only a few kilometers away from the Dnieper Bridge in the west and from Zhuliany Airport. At this point, the role of the 5th Parachute Brigade, led by General Alexander, who had been awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union for his services in the Spanish Civil War, came into play. After a year and a half of the Battle of Kiev, he would become one of the most famous heroes of the Soviet Union in World War II for his remarkably valiant role in its defense. At sunset on August 9, 1941, Soviet artillery opened fire on the area adjacent to the airport to cover the infiltration of men behind it. Imagine the Germans suddenly coming under one last desperate defensive attack from the airport's pilots, only to discover that the situation was entirely different. At dawn, the next day, the Soviet paratroopers managed to push the Germans back 4 kilometers, and more importantly, they gained additional time to defend Kiev. For each passing day, new reinforcements arrived from the east. Every day, fresh forces appeared. If you review the Red Army's documents from this period, you will find that on that very day, the 284th Artillery Division arrived, precisely on that day. In any case, the fierce fighting at the Stalin Line and the subsequent events delayed the German advance, and with each week of delay, the Soviet command sent in more military units. In the end, the Soviets consolidated all the forces defending Kiev into a single administrative formation, designated as the 37th Army, and this formation then launched a large-scale, organized counterattack against the German forces. The Soviet counteroffensive managed to liberate several suburbs of Kiev in the south and re-establish the 2 defensive lines around the city. By late August, indications were that the German assault had subsided and lost its momentum. Despite the intense fighting, life inside Kiev continued as normally and routinely as ever. The residents had no inkling of how dire the situation was on the outskirts, especially with efforts to control the news among the populace. At that time, the Soviets were breathing a sigh of relief, believing that they had finally repelled the German attack. Meanwhile, a transport plane was landing at an airport in eastern Prussia, and it appeared that the plane was carrying an important guest. The commander of Panzer Group II, General Heinz Guderian, had come on this plane specifically to meet Hitler and say, "Sir, you are making a strategic mistake." Admittedly, Hitler was concerned about the slow progress of the Southern Army Group, which was supposed to seize the agricultural regions of Ukraine. On that front, the Soviets were resisting fiercely, creating a gap in the German attack line. As a result of this gap, the southern wing of the Central Army Group was exposed. Moreover, another matter troubling Hitler was the Soviet air raids on the oil fields in Romania, Germany's ally. These raids were launched from the Crimean Peninsula and threatened Germany's oil supplies essential for mobilizing its military forces. For this reason, Hitler decided to move Panzer Group II south to help encircle the Soviet forces defending that area. This group was under Guderian's command. He was astonished, exclaiming, "This is nonsense. Our objective is the Soviet Union. We want to take Moscow and dismantle the political and military system, and then everything will collapse on all fronts." Guderian's viewpoint is, in fact, a subject of debate in this episode. I welcome your opinions in the comments. He believed that, in terms of time and resources, the German forces had launched their attack on the Soviet Union too late, entering a race against the Russian winter, and we all know how formidable that winter could be. Hitler listened to Guderian's remarks with respect and focus, then retorted, "I have some generals who know nothing about the economic aspects of this war. What do you think about this disagreement? Was Hitler right, or was Guderian correct?" Please share your views in the comments. Taking Hitler's response, Guderian then proceeded directly to Ukraine, where 150 miles southeast of Kiev, The Germans were on the verge of crossing the Dnieper River in front of weak Soviet resistance. The Soviets' greatest fear was the German tanks, which were still on the move. A front under the command of General Andrei received orders to attack Guderian's wing as it advanced south. General Germanko, a very respected and distinguished officer, was in charge of a force that unfortunately only had a few dilapidated tanks which could not withstand the might of Panzer Group II. On September 10th, Guderian arrived in Romania, 210 kilometers east of Kiev. With the threat of encirclement growing, the Soviet Southwestern Front requested permission to withdraw. However, the high command in Moscow hesitated, apparently still hoping that they could repel Guderian's intervention and save Kiev. The gap between the German pincers was about 180 kilometers. The southern pincer in Encirclement was formed after the German infantry crossed the Dnieper River without any Soviet resistance, since the Soviets were too afraid of tanks, which were still far away, to oppose the infantry. In 1941, General Karbanos Mikhail was appointed commander of the Kiev military district. A brave, agile, and dynamic leader, he had been honored as a hero of the Soviet Union for his performance in the Winter War against Finland. As commander of the 37th Army, Karbanos tried by every means to convince the high command in Moscow that the right decision was to withdraw his forces. Yet, each time he was met with refusal due to orders for a stubborn defense of Kiev. On the contrary, the Soviet command was sending even more troops. Meanwhile, as messages were exchanged between Karbanos and the Soviet high command, the German engineering corps was ferrying von Kleist's forces across the Dnieper River on a bridge 2 kilometers long, thus enabling the tanks to finally reach Encirclement. At the same time, Soviet military intelligence, still in a deep slumber, saw the sun rise as the Soviets prepared for an incoming attack from the north led by Guderian, when in fact the real blow was coming from the south, led by von Kleist. In September, for the last time, Karbanos attempted to warn the Soviet high command of the impending disaster, only to be met with scornful remarks. "These fears of encirclement are all in your head. You're on your own." The irony was that 2 days after this encirclement, Colonel Sheik, a respected man from the high command, approached Karbanos and said, "Fine, since you are determined to withdraw, go ahead and withdraw." The truth, folks, is that Stalin rejected the idea of a withdrawal. In principle, he was not much different from Hitler, regardless of the military necessity. He was that way, and he had executed many generals simply for requesting a withdrawal. Karbanos was no fool. When he received the withdrawal order, he demanded a written confirmation of Stalin's approval and announced that he would not move outside Kiev's gates without it. The confirmation arrived on September 17th, after which the Red Army began evacuating the city within 48 hours, moving across the river to the east. The Germans advanced with intense bombardments on the suburbs and then began crossing the bridges. The Soviets destroyed the bridges after crossing them to prevent the Germans from pursuing. Within 5 days of fierce and desperate fighting, the Soviet Southwestern Army Group disintegrated into small pockets of resistance. Some Red Army units held out for about 10 days, a courageous struggle, as the attack came from every direction, leaving no escape. Many soldiers attempted to flee and infiltrate through the German lines, but those who managed to escape were herded into valleys and forests by tanks and other German units. Ultimately, 500,000 Red Army soldiers were taken prisoner in what became the largest encirclement in military history, and fewer than 20,000 Soviet soldiers managed to break out of the siege. General Karbanos himself was killed while attempting to escape, along with his chief of staff, Vasily Tepikov, and nearly all his senior officers and aides. General Guderian, however, believed that the Battle of Kiev was a magnificent tactical success, albeit one without purpose and lacking strategic importance, since true strategic success would have been the capture of Moscow before the onset of winter. I, too, am still waiting for your opinions on this disagreement involving Guderian. As for this episode, all that remains is for me to invite you to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so that you receive the new episodes as soon as they are published. I also invite you to join the channel's membership program to help support the production of this content alongside our current members, whom I thank and thank you all. I'll see you in the next episode.